Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism, Kim Stanley Robinson. This is the fourth time we have spoken. It has been an absolute thrill. Thank you so much for coming back.
It's my pleasure, Graham. It's really fun to talk about something other than ministry for the future.
So actually, that's one of my questions is about ministry of the future. But we can hold that, or rather, the relationship between this book and ministry of the future. I'm going to
Yeah,
hold off on that question right
sure.
now,
Uh-huh.
and I just want to start off with, and I believe this is how I started off my conversations with you on in the previous three books. So just or the previous three conversations, two of which were trilogies, which is just how did you come to write this novel? What led you to? Well, I should say, let me introduce. The novel is Green Earth. It was written originally as a trilogy. You edited it down into a single volume, and I read the single volume version on your advice. That's the only one I've read. So I guess, how did you come to write the novels? And maybe we can get to the follow up of how you came to turn it into a single novel.
Sure. Um, Let me think back. Let's see. My wife and I were living in Washington, D.C. This was, say, um, 1988 until 91. And um, it was an interesting time. I liked many aspects of living in Washington, D.C., and I got to know it as well as one can, living in 3 years up on the Maryland border in Bethesda. And then we moved back to California, and I finished off the Mars trilogy. That took many years. And I was I went to Antarctica, and I wrote my Antarctic novel, and the scientists down there were all talking about climate change. This was 95. I wrote the book in 96. It came out in 97. And I was interested, but I had this ongoing idea that I'd had for 20 years at least on an alternative history in which all the Europeans died in the Black Death around 1400. And world history went on after that in an obviously different way. And I wanted to trace that different way. So a novel covering 700 years, it was kind of a mind-boggling prospect. But the Mars trilogy had taught me how to do novels covering long stretches of time. And I used the same method, more or less, the same structure and novel form to write The Years of Rice and Salt, which was a massive project, maybe the most difficult in certain senses of my entire life. And it took about 3 years. Then after that, in the midst of that, during those years, I'm trying to remember here, so I'm fumbling around a little bit. But I had been asked by the National Science Foundation to come back to Washington, D.C., and to be on juries to decide who would get the grants to go to Antarctica. These were artists and writers. And the
Mm.
same form of juries they used as they do for their science grants. They gather together a group, it's peer review in a group style where they ask people to come to Washington, D.C. for like 3 days. They pay for their travel, but they don't get paid anything more than that. It's basically a public service, or it's scientific credit service, interesting in itself. And you hang in a room and you discuss briefly all the applications, and you rank them, 1 to 10 or whatever. And then you give over to NSF a recommendation of, these are the people we think you ought to give the grant to. And then NSF decides on their own. It's an advisory board only.
Hmm.
And I did it twice, and I found it fascinating. And I also was thinking hard about how this is a system that is an honor system. It requires honesty and integrity from everybody who joins the panel. And and that includes the person running it, of course, at NSF. And NSF has people that devote their lives to it, and then they have guest scientists who come to NSF and work there for a year doing the work of processing grants. They used to call them jackets. So you would have a certain amount of jackets per week. It's hard work to figure out how to disperse, $8 billion a year in scientific research grants. And a lot of people do that, and they get a year off from their jobs. They're often academics. Sometimes they're in industry. They get a year off from their regular academic jobs, because I think mostly they are academics, and then they go back to their institution. But meanwhile, they've been running these processes. And I was thinking, boy, an unscrupulous outsider could come in, run an NSF grant, see a grant application that had immense financial potential, like for a new biotechnological cure for a disease that if a drug company were to get hold of it and develop it, they would make billions. You could perhaps reject that grant and then go back and buy it privately through a startup. And I spent a lot of time in San Diego, where I went to college, and I went to college for a long time. And there are a lot of biological startups, and I have friends, and one of them was in two biological startups and then joined another one that was more secure. And he told me stories all the time when we hiked together, when we ran together, about how bio biotechnological startups work. So I had the NSF view, I had the biotech startup view, and then a book came out called Abrupt Climate Change, and it was edited by a Richard Halley, who's an active, famous glaciologist. And in analyzing the Greenland data, they had come up with this remarkable finding about 8,000 BC, or maybe it was 11,000 years ago. Right now I'm fuzzy on the dates, but as we were coming out of the last ice age, so shifting into the Holocene from whatever it was before, about 11,000 years ago, let's say, we had gone from a warm, wet climate to a cold, dry climate in 3 years. And it was as clear as could be in the data. And at that point, I thought to myself, I've got a story here. I can finally write about climate change, where the speed, the geologists are always talking about, oh my God, it's so fast. And I would ask them, how fast? And they would say 500 years. And so when I got this finding, 3 years, and then the explanation for it, which was fresh water pouring off of the great ice cap of the north into the Atlantic, reducing its salinity to the point where the Gulf Stream stalled. And now that's called the AMOC, or the current system is, I think, called the AMOC, Atlantic Meridional Ocean Current. But we know it on the surface as the Gulf Stream, and up in the North Atlantic, it cools, it sinks, and it runs south. So it's like a conveyor belt. And then all the world's oceans are connected up in these conveyor belts, where on the surface it's going one way, in the depths it's usually going the opposite direction. And that's how, the water moves around. I had a story then, and I thought, I'm going to jam all these together and I'm going to make it a thriller. And the final bit of the story, which I never ended up using, was an FBI agent had been arrested. And it turned out he had been a double agent for the Soviets, because this was back in the 80s when it happened, late Soviet Union, for almost his whole career. And I thought, I'll throw all these elements in the hopper, including our life in Washington, D.C. with a newborn. This was perhaps the bad idea, the idea that sunk it for me. And so I threw all those in the hopper. I made a proposal to Bantam Books, which was my editor at the time. I said, I'll do a trilogy. It'll be a Washington, D.C. thriller. It'll have double agents, blah, blah, blah. Most of that turned out not to be true. But they said yes. They bought the trilogy, and I began to write it around 2002. So that's how it began.
Okay, great. I mean that leads me to the next thing. I have a friend who jokes that whenever you're on my podcast, I ask you about Herman Melville. So I guess this is the part where I ask you about Herman Melville, because Moby Dick famously is a book that seems to be a different book, and the protagonist of Moby Dick is I think his name is Bulkington. Except he disappears. He is not the protagonist of the book, even though it's clear that he was once the protagonist in Melville's view. The book you described to me just now, I recognize that book, and that's the book that I thought I was reading at the beginning of Green Earth. And the main character, if there is a single main character, is the Kim Stanley Robinson figure, the stay at home dad. And then there's also this Charlie, I believe, is the character's name. And there's an unscrupulous proto villain named Frank. Right? I have that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's another
Unscrup-
Frank for sure.
yes, Frank is doing precisely as you say. He's manipulating the NSF process for his own gain. He's clearly bad. Um, And by the second and third novel, although it's harder for me to trace since I read it as a single volume, Frank is by far the main character.
Yes.
Has far outstripped Charlie and Anna, who is
Yes.
Charlie's wife and Frank's boss, sort of. And Frank has more or less become not just the protagonist, but the hero, the good guy, the one who is doing the most to advance saving the world. And he also, perhaps this ties into the way that he is not the villain. He has also undergone a personality transformation. So that's the next question. Like, first of all, do I have this right? And how did the novel go from being a few people orbiting the NSF, including one unscrupulous guy who was going to make a lot of money in San Diego, to a story about the entire world defeating climate change with this guy, formerly unscrupulous guy, as the point of view character?
Well, first, I want to say thank you. That is an accurate description of that book. And I don't always hear accurate descriptions of that book because it's big and messy. And so I'm glad that you saw it that way, because I see it that way also. And I can, in fact, give an explanation. And it's so many years later, 20 years later. And I've kind of gotten over the trauma of it. I can talk about it, I think, in ways that are not too defensive, because really I was pretty lost in the writing of that book. It took most of 5 years, and I thought it would be funny to write a book about the current day as if it were a science fiction novel with all kinds of things explained, and kind of a comic alien view from Mars, like as if I was describing stuff in the Mars trilogy, but it was actually just the ordinary workings of Washington, D.C. Well, that wasn't working out that well as I began to do it, although it struck me as a funny idea, but it wasn't turning out funny. It was turning out laborious, with lots of scenes inside meeting rooms. This is the first volume in particular. You could call it the first third now. And you can only have so many conversations in meeting rooms, official meetings at that, without beginning to realize you've boxed yourself in, literally and narratively. Then also, putting me and my family in the book was a mistake, in that it's bad mojo. What can you say or do about those characters that isn't psychically dangerous or spiritually dangerous? It's bad mojo. You couldn't have anything bad happen to them. And if you, because what if it then came true? And believe me, that kind of stuff does happen when you're writing novels. People are sometimes looking at me with an accusatory glance because I wrote about something that later came true, and it was just a coincidence, obviously. But there is a certain shamanic power to storytelling that looks like prophecy sometime. And I thought, this is too intrusive into my wife's life, my family's life, and my two sons. I retrojected our second son into Washington, D.C. He didn't actually get born until after we left, but I needed him for the story because he was one of the most interesting characters. And to a certain extent, Joe Quibbler, the younger son, is an important character in that they think maybe he's a reincarnated Tibetan Lama, then they think he don't. Then that whole plot line was a good bit, and it didn't seem very intrusive on my younger son's life because I'm talking about a 2-year-old, and indeed he was an extremely energetic and difficult 2-year-old, like most of them are. So that was going okay, but I had made some mistakes. The indoorness, the intrusion into my family life. How could I solve it? Frank began to become interesting. He's not a bad guy, but he is making some bad moves. He and his girlfriend bought a house together, and then he took a mortgage out on it without telling her about it. And then when they broke up, in effect, he owes her about $60,000 that he has no way to pay. He's guilty about that. He's guilty about thinking I could just deny this grant and then get it stuck into this biotech where I'm an advisor and I have some shares, and that biotech would make a lot of money. He's not real comfortable with that either. He sees that it's possible, but then, as you point out, he has a satori. He has an epiphany. He's so upset that right at the moment where climate change hammers Washington, D.C., with a gigantic flood, which is entirely possible. I looked at the topographical maps, and Washington, D.C. is like about 1 foot above sea level. And the Potomac is a giant catchment basin where if it was to rain heavily in the Potomac Basin, D.C. would go underwater. So at that point, I thought, I need to spring this novel while I can. And in the second book, so in the middle, I shifted the emphasis. And there's still Charlie and Anna and Joe and that plot line. But mostly the novel bursts outdoors. I make Frank a homeless person. I make him hang out with a group of homeless guys that I knew well because they lived in Davis, California on my Frisbee golf course. So the homeless guys in the DC novel are accurate portraits of what I've seen over, at that point, about a 10-year period of a group of supposed Vietnam vets, and I suppose a couple of them were. So that dates them, who were homeless. And the novel shot outdoors and immediately became more interesting to me, and I thought probably for sure more interesting to readers as well.
Okay, I guess it's time to talk about Ministry of the Future. I loved Green Earth, Stan. I thought it was thrilling, especially the second two thirds after it gets outdoors. I did think though, because I had not read this novel before, that it seemed really similar to Ministry of the Future in a lot of ways, and I just wanted to know. I mean, I'm willing to assert flatly that it is similar to Ministry of the Future in a lot of ways. So I'm wondering if there's a way that Ministry of the Future is a second crack at this for you, or was there some way that it was really a different project? Because they are both near future techno thrillers in which climate change causes catastrophe, and yet the the international order of scientists, activists, and governments and bankers does manage to, if not, solve or save, ameliorate, and create a livable biosphere. In that respect, they are similar, and that is not what the Mars trilogy is, or Years of Rice and Salt is, or anything like that.
Yes. No, I recognize what you're saying, and there's a lot of truth in it. I would say, yes, it's another crack at it, but also it's not just the first and second. It's more like the second and fifth. So I've been trying to portray a world coping with climate change since the Antarctic novel, and indeed in the Mars trilogy, when they go back to Earth, they find a
Yes.
wrecked, drowned planet that has been hammered by climate change and the disassembly of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which raises sea level very quickly and very high. So it's been a long time concern. the fate of the Earth in the Anthropocene. We're wrecking it. It could hammer us. What are we going to do about it? Multiple attempts at the same storyline. So the Mars trilogy, of course, is mostly about Mars, but terraforming Mars is like geoengineering Earth. So there's similarities there. Then Antarctica. That, of course, is very Antarctic, but when Wade leaves Washington, D.C., it's like 130 degrees and it's like a Turkish bath.
Yeah.
And it's a climate change novel of a sort. Then comes Green Earth. And then after that, I would say that in 2312 and in New York 2140, that, and even to a certain extent in Aurora, I was still always dealing with climate change on Earth. And yet, Green Earth was the big attempt. How do we cope using institutions? And it was the
Yeah.
NSF and the US federal government in Green Earth. For Ministry for the Future, the thing I was focusing in on was, could we make this more global? Let's not get stuck in DC anymore. Because truthfully, I crawled out of that novel. When I finished 60 Days and Counting, I crawled away and said, okay, that didn't work. Or so I made mistakes. I did the best I could, and I crawled away. And then I wrote Galileo's Dream, and I kind of recollected my brain. As a novelist, I among my own works, I quite love Galileo's Dream, and it was kind of a restorative, because I was thinking, well, maybe I'm just done as a novelist. And then Galileo, he was never done. He had much harder experiences than writing an unsuccessful novel, and he just kept working harder than ever. So writing about Galileo was inspiring to just grit your teeth, bear down, and tough it out and write more. And I had a resurgence. And then I had a shift to an editor, Tim Holman at Orbit Books, 2 3-book contracts with him. And the last one of them was Ministry. They all were well platformed by Tim and the rest of his company, supported, encouraged, helped. Just a tremendous publishing relationship, which is very important for a writer that at this point, I was in my 60s. And most writers don't get their 60s as a coherent package of support and encouragement. It's mostly a scramble at that point because people like new things, new writers. So in this resurgence, I kept coming back to the climate change thing. And I was at the end of the second contract and I was thinking, damn, I've got to try the climate change story again. And this time, I want to try to make it international. I want to make it lots of protagonists, not just one tiny group in DC of technocrats, but a wide crowd of actors and all the methods and all the things where I felt like I had blown it in the Green Earth project in terms of my choices to begin with. I mean, I think it was interesting enough, scene by scene. And eventually I began to admire it as a novel about Washington, D.C., in the Bush Jr. years, because nobody has written about that experience with any kind of insight or excitement. And so I began to admire it. And before I started Ministry for the Future, I went at the DC trilogy, and I said to my editor, another great editor, another Brit, Jane Johnson, I wish I could get that book into one volume. And she said, look, if you cut it down to, I don't know, 1,000 pages, and it was maybe 1,400 pages. I'm roughing it out here because I don't remember the numbers. Cut it by 15%, cut it by 20%. We'll get it into one volume for you. And she said it's a good idea because that book, that trilogy needs to be read as one book, and it's too long. And I realized that the idea of writing the present day as if it was a science fiction story had led me to do too much of what people accuse me of all the time, which is exposition. And I was explaining things that everybody knows already. So I cut, and it was a pleasure to go through the trilogy. 40 Signs of Rain got cut by about 25%. 50 Degrees Below was solid as a rock. I just cut it where I could. 60 Days and Counting, I cut about 15%. It too had a lot of unnecessary stuff in it. And I don't want to be too disparaging of it. I did my best I could. But when I got that thing slimmed down, I thought, okay, this is a solid entry in my body of work now. It's my best attempt at Current Day and Washington, D.C., both gnarly projects for novels, I have to say. And that was inspirational to do ministry and to avoid the mistakes and make sure that ministry was going like a bat out of hell at all times. No lengthy descriptions of breakfast or of bureaucratic meetings. Notice that there's notes for bureaucratic meetings rather than the meetings dramatized. And I was having a lot of fun correcting the formal problems that I had experienced in writing Green Earth. The writing of ministry was a joy in many ways, even despite the dire material. It was a joy to write because I was free. I was, again, like you say, taking a second whack at the same material.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. Maybe this is a rude question. We can strike it if it is. Are you? I'm frustrated that Ministry of the Future has received as much attention as it has with respect to Green Earth. It's frustrating to me that no one, for all the praise heaped on Ministry of the Future, which I'm all for, I loved that book. Do you feel like people missed what you did here?
Well, I'm um, not really. To a large extent, uh, um, I feel like it was my fault. Then also my publishers, the relationship at Bantam was falling apart. It was too early to talk about climate change. People thought that was just a science fiction topic.
Mm,
I will say this, in the same week that 40 Signs of Rain came out, um, Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth came out,
yeah,
and the movie The Day After Tomorrow came out. And so those are movies, those were high profile. And 40 Signs of Rain was just the opening of a trilogy, and it was all a bunch of techno talk inside offices in DC. It didn't make much of a mark. It was well reviewed, and it sold less well than the Years of Rice and Salt, which that's partly because Years of Rice and Salt sold very well. And that was partly because the Mars trilogy was still selling quite well.
yeah.
So, in a way, things conspired. I'm not saying it was all my fault. It was situational. It was the world. It was a combination of factors, and I had to finish off that trilogy with it getting less and less attention in the way of trilogies. If the first book in a trilogy doesn't make a mark on the world, then the second and the third book are really going to disappear. And as I say, I was thinking, well, I'm an old man. I'm 55 or whatever. This was absurd from my perspective now. But I was thinking, I actually was reconciled to it as being essentially a just response from the world that I hadn't really solved the problem. And also, nobody wanted to think about the problem. So it was a bad combination. And now I'm not frustrated at all. That was a low point in my career in thinking about things as a novelist in the world and having a readership. But what happened afterwards is very gratifying, and I am absolutely um, happy at the way Ministry for the Future has rocked people and given them hope and changed their thinking and opened their eyes and reoriented even careers. It's been uh, a wild ride. It's 4.5 years now since Ministry came out, and I've done nothing but Ministry. And so that is why I began by saying it's good to talk about other books of mine, because I did do other novels that I quite love. And in fact, Ministry is in purely novelistic terms, it's maybe not my best novel, but it's certainly my most important novel and the one that is best known now. Maybe the Mars trilogy still bulks big, but because of the world we're in now, Ministry for the Future is much more important.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that all makes sense. I was thinking. You've mentioned to me multiple times. Glad that we're talking about something besides Minute in the Future.
Oh yeah,
This is
yes. Well, I'm well over 500 gigs for Ministry. and that's a lot of gigs.
Well, I mean, I think we can. Let's just pencil this now. I think let's talk on the 10th anniversary. We can get to Ministry of the Future in 5.5 years. I don't need a
That
firm
seems right.
commitment now. Yeah, but that's
I like that idea. Yeah.
yeah, good, wonderful. And I would say, I mean, the other thing I want to go back to, for if people who haven't read it, Antarctica. I agree. It does feel again like a sort of single volume climate change techno thriller novel in a way that maybe the Mars trilogy could be if it were edited into a single volume. But I wouldn't recommend that. And I also hear what you say in terms of the Green Earth and Antarctica being more what's happening is global, but the attention is in this one place, a place where there's actually a lot of bureaucratic and scientific expertise, um, but not as you don't have India as a place where so much stuff happens in Green Earth or Antarctica in the same way. I mean, and not just India, many places. Obviously, that's where it starts, is in India. Um, so let's talk about catastrophe then. I want to talk about catastrophe in the works of Kim Stanley Robinson. I was reading this book, Green Earth, over the holidays, and one of the kind of crazy uncle figures in my life asked me what it was, and I said, "Oh, it's sort of a book. I guess it's kind of a book about the idea that government and scientists can effectively deal with and eventually solve climate change." Something like that. And he said, "Oh, I mean, that could never happen. I mean, not without lots and lots of catastrophes." And I immediately said, like, no, those are in the the catastrophes are in the book. Like, this, it seems to me that people want one of two answers: the day after tomorrow answer, the catastrophe is coming, or the Star Trek answer, science will get ahead of the catastrophe and prevent it. I see in Green Earth, as well as Ministry of the Future and the Mars trilogy, the idea that the catastrophe is coming, the catastrophe does come, and the problem is ultimately solved without being erased and without the utopia arising. How does that sound to you?
Yes, that sounds accurate to me. And what I like about this description of it, first, I think it's accurate, but secondly, it points out that climate change is not an existential threat for human beings per se. The species will not go extinct. We are too flexible, technological, smart, and numerous, and accommodating to adaptable to circumstances. What will happen is a mass extinction event of other creatures, our fellow beings on this planet, our horizontal brothers and sisters, as Muir called them. We will have caused a mass extinction event where many species will be wiped out forever and will not come back. That's bad A. And then the other thing that'll happen to human civilization, even though humans might not go extinct, civilization could crash. There could be mass death. So there are some climate change, not deniers, but denier of seriousness people. Like, okay, it's going to happen. We'll just adapt. That kind of eco-modernist thing. And there's worse problems than that, like world poverty, which most of these people don't actually give a shit about in their daily life and actions. But in any case, they're trying to seize on a straw man argument. Since humans won't go extinct, and since some climate change activists are calling it an existential danger and humans might go extinct, they're being stupid. Therefore, the problem is not serious. So this is a trick of rhetoric, and they call it the straw man argument because you build your opponent out of straw, knock the crap out of it, and then say that you've won the argument. Whereas the real point has been dodged entirely, which is that civilization could crash, and the world could become a failed state like Somalia or Syria or someplace, or South Sudan. That could happen, and that's bad enough. You don't need extinction to be put on guard that we're headed for something so serious you don't want it to happen. You don't. And now, uh, maybe I don't need to go into the details of how that catastrophe could come about, but I'll just say this: massive sea level rise, and also food shortages, or even the scare, a food panic, would be enough to disrupt supplies. And then suddenly 8 billion people couldn't be fed, and suddenly there'd be wars, and suddenly there'd be disruption, and suddenly there'd be 3 billion people dead, and maybe more, unless some weird sort of police state salvation came in some ugly, horrible way. So, okay, the danger's high, even though it's not existential. And this is what is hard to explain without going on like I just have, and hard to write about, to pitch the right level of seriousness. This is deadly serious. This is emergency time. This is danger beyond any humans have ever faced before. Although I say that if you go back in the long history of humans, they have faced ice ages, etc., but not in this number of people, not at the top of a tower of prostheses that we've built for ourselves, that we're delicately balanced on and can fall off of. This is a unique crisis time, and it needs to be treated as such. So, this is like the day after Trump became president or whatever. This is all of the banks that signed up for net zero back at the Glasgow COP26. They're all leaving it at once. There's a feeling that we are beginning to say, oh, since we can't meet the 1.5 maximum temperature rise level that we set for ourselves, we might as well give up on everything. Why not go back to fossil fuels and just do a death dive, a kind of a Götterdämmerung? And so we're speaking actually in a moment of rather bad feeling, disarray, discouragement, like we're not coping. On the other hand, in many ways, we are coping. I've seen it the last 4 years. The intensity and the variety of efforts to try to cope with climate change are impressive, and they possibly could succeed. There are problems that maybe even Ministry for the Future doesn't go into enough, which is active resistance from the fossil fuels industry. And part of that resistance includes buying governments, and therefore dodging regulation and making promises they have no intention of fulfilling. This is very common now. So it's going to be a political battle for the rest of our lives that will have physical ramifications. But there's no doubt at all that it's dangerous as hell. And I'm actually, to say that at the end of Green Earth, written about 2006, well, it was an easy call then. People had been saying it for 20 years, since Hansen spoke to Congress in 1988. And even someone warned President Lyndon Johnson, the CO2 problem is severe. So it's not like I needed to be any kind of prophet or prescient. I was just reporting the news and casting it out into the near future. But now I'm more and more pleased that Green Earth exists, and is a story like with you. People can always go back to it and read it now, and it will read like a historical novel. What did things feel like during the Bush years? But it'll also be a climate change novel.
Yeah, and this happens as we age. I mean, I'm only in my 40s, but my students don't the students don't know about the Bush years. So this would be, the same way that we give them Dreiser so that they will know what it was like when the big department stores were built. We can
Yes.
give them this.
Yes.
We can give them this. I mean, I actually think Dreiser is a good comparison. What you and Dreiser have in common, I mean, in a lot of ways, Dreiser is not a good comparison, but in terms of Dreiser is very interested in the stuff of the world, the things, the material reality of the world, and the new ways of people have interacting with them. And honestly, your description of the sort of like an alien's eye view,
Yeah.
Dreiser does that. It's like, what is a department store? if ever we don't know what a department store is, if that bit of Wikipedia has been lost, you can read Dreiser. And I imagine the people at the time thought, why is he going on? I mean, Willa Cather famously said that she was interested in getting rid of all the bric-a-brac, like
Yeah,
literally
yeah,
bric-a-brac, the stuff
yeah.
in the novel. And Cather's novels are brilliant, but they won't tell you what it was like to be in that room, physically in that room, what it felt like, what the fabrics were. Dreiser does, and to a certain extent you do. Perhaps I need to go back and read the other ones. Maybe it'll probably seem even more Dreiserian, the original version of the trilogy.
Well, I think that's right, and I'm glad you brought that up because Dreiser is an example of what in our English major lives we would call naturalism, which is a version of realism. So Dreiser, Sinclair Lewis, Upton Sinclair, Frank O'Hara, these people were out of Zola, Emile Zola, and so Balzac, that's realism. Flaubert, that's modernism. Zola is naturalism, where you do include the bric-a-brac and try to explain things with the alien's eye point of view. So my teacher was Frederick Jameson, and how I
Yes.
loved him. And he was my teacher for 53 years until his death last September, which I regret extremely. I miss him like crazy. And he was very good on these genre distinctions, which he was kind of the leading theorist of. And he was fond of naturalism without suggesting that it was something that you would want to read every day. Um, he also was interested in the idea that science fiction was kind of a history of the future, that it was indeed a fake realism. And he liked what I was doing, and sometimes would say to me I was doing naturalism, but realism, but also in the postmodern era, postmodernism following modernism. In postmodernism, you can choose any earlier moment and do a pastiche of it. And then you've got something new and interesting because there's still that postmodern self consciousness of it. And for sure, what one always wants as a writer, at least in the tradition that I'm talking about, is that you also be regarded as some kind of modernist who's really knowledgeable and playing with the forms of the material, with the novel per se, that you know what you're doing and you're doing something not out of instinct or because it's the thing that's being done that year, but because you got a view of the whole thing. And so you want to write, for instance, like Daniel Defoe, you write like Daniel Defoe. If you do that in the year 2020, then you're doing something both postmodern and hopefully fun and interesting in literary terms. So, yes, I mean, Dreiser is a slog, but he's an interesting slog.
Yeah, I agree. The only other thing, I mean, gosh, I've got, you mentioned, I think, in the intro, there's a kitchen sink joke. Everything's in this book. I want to talk about Buddhism and Thoreau and Emerson and all sorts of things, but there's only one thing I feel like now that I just absolutely need to talk about, which is, I mean, thinking about Dreiser and naturalism. So I think it's Deleuze who says that naturalism is really, it's about the slope. It's going down the slope, and the slope is down. There, you can have upward slopes, but naturalism doesn't have them. And there's a
Hmm.
review of Ministry of the Future. I think it might be by Fukuyama, that says something like the book is ridiculous because everything goes perfectly right, or something like that. That's a caricature, but that's the gist of it, if I'm remembering correctly. And I see why he felt that way. It's wrong. Ministry of the Future, I mean, like Green Earth and like that statement I made to the crazy uncle, Green Earth is not a book in which everything goes right. It's a book in which a lot of things go wrong. The panics you talk about do occur. DC does flood. There is a global sea rise, but the slope is upward. And
Mm.
I don't know how to quite put this. I don't want to say that you minimize the catastrophes, but you do not luxuriate in the catastrophes. They are important to explain what the characters are up against and what is going wrong, but they are not the point. Or I guess I've turned that's a statement, and so I guess now just I ask the same question again. Does that sound right to you? And if so, why? I think I understand why that would be your approach, but I would want to hear it from you.
Yeah, well, I want to write utopian science fiction. So, as you were putting it, the slope goes up. The future society is in some respects better than where we are now. How does that happen? So, it's a story of struggle. And I'll just want to say parenthetically that Fukuyama himself is ridiculous because he's forever tagged with his great statement that history ended in 1991. And he's been scrambling in right wing think tanks ever since, trying to overcome that incredible faux pas, if that's what it was. And since nobody cares what historians say about history, it isn't very important, but it is deeply silly. And so for
I
him to
just
say,
I just
it
want to
made me
break in
laugh.
and say if you want to claim that there's something wrong with a work because it suggests that everything is getting endlessly better, Francis Fukuyama is the wrong person to
Yeah,
make this claim because
exactly.
that's literally his most famous claim is that we don't have to worry about bad things happening in the future. I know that's an exaggeration, but that's certainly much more true, I think, of Fukuyama's work than of Ministry of the Future.
Well, his notion that neoliberal capitalism was the end of history is not just silly but bad. And so
It's cataclysmic.
one of his objections to Ministry for the Future is that ultimately this is an eco-socialist novel. And without wanting to ever say I object to him politically, he wants to say I object to him politically.
Yeah.
So this very often political objections to my work are couched in aesthetic terms or in terms of plausibility, because then I want to take it straight on. It doesn't matter. The book has gotten so much criticism from so many different angles. It's a lightning rod, but to back to your main point of your question, which I think is much more important, if you're trying to do utopian science fiction and you're in the world we're in right now, the best you can portray is a kind of an optopia, a best case scenario. If you write a novel that the reader, when they come out of it, they quote unquote believe in it, there's no point at which they've been thrown out of the novel by saying that could never happen. Well, someone like Fukuyama can say that, and Bill Gates said, "Oh well, none of the solutions will really work," even though he quite likes the novel. He's recommended it twice. They don't like the idea of socialism. These are capitalists talking. So it's okay because the book explicitly says that a combination of governments supported by people, by citizens, everybody doing their best without a plan. And this, I think, is what's shocking about Ministry for the Future, and maybe, well, controversial for sure, and could turn out to be wrong, is that without a good plan, everybody doing their best, we can kludge our way forward to a better result. If we admit the reality of the problem, and if we all apply ourselves to the different aspects of the problem and put our shoulders to different parts of the wheel, you could, in fact, get past the moment of fossil fuels. You could begin to draw down CO2 out of the atmosphere by various means, stabilize the glaciers in Antarctica even, and get to a point late in this century where things are not perfect, but they aren't spiraling into catastrophe. So it's like a coping mechanism. Like, okay, the ship is sinking. Can we all get off in a scramble of life rafts and broken bits of the ship? Yes, we can. And then we're all floating in the ocean incoherently. Is that really utopia? Well, it's better than everybody dying. So that's the only believable utopia that we've got right now.
Stan, that was just fantastic. I mean, I guess briefly, perhaps wrongly, to bring this back into my terms and sort of the larger project I've got for this podcast, I use the term anarchism, and the reason why I use that term, I mean, I have some deep affection for certain key anarchists like Kropotkin, but the thing I'm afraid of, the reason why I use the term anarchism as opposed to socialism or something like that, is I'm afraid of this idea that I see often in both progressive circles and even more so in whatever you want to call them, Marxist circles or socialist circles, that the problem is we don't have a Leviathan, a good Leviathan, a centralized power who will figure it out, punish the bad people, put the processes in place, and then things will work. And I tell people that if you read your work, or the work of Cory Doctorow, or the work of James Fallows, who on a surface level, I mean, he was Carter's speechwriter and a journalist. He doesn't seem like the kind of eco-socialist that someone might think of. But I tell people all of these people sort of capture a lot of what I'm interested in. And it is precisely what you said, Stan, that if we are all doing our best and working on this, we can solve the world's problems. There's one set of people that we know are wrong because they're saying, no, no, these problems aren't real, and actually capitalism is good and we should have more oil. Those people are bad and wrong. But the people who say, no, no, you don't want to just do your best. We need to stop. We need to figure out what needs to be done. We don't need bold and persistent experimentation. We need a plan and a boss and an implementation. Those people, while they are broadly on my side, I think they're wrong. And I love that what I had identified in your work. Roman Krasnarek and I also spoke about this, about your work, is this sense that if we are all, it's almost Emersonian, they're all tied in. It's almost Emersonian. If everyone is doing their best, themselves and their community, and arguing for what they think is right and working towards it, that's plan enough for any problem.
Well, I have some thoughts about that, as you can
By all means,
imagine.
take the last word.
Yeah, if we're all focused on doing the best we can in the structure of capitalism, then we are all being compelled against our will to do to support the 1% and to be
Yes.
wage slaves and the precariat, and our good efforts are being impeded by the profit motive and by capitalism. So we've talked about this before. What I take out of anarchism that I find useful is not absence of rules, but absence of rulers. And anarchism in the Greek can be interpreted either way, and sometimes both ways. But the part that I
Yeah.
find valuable is horizontalization of power, which is highly vertical these days, and equality of power, where every citizen has like 1/8 billionth of the power on the planet. Then doing your best means
Yes.
you're in solidarity with everybody else rather than just supporting the oligarchy. So it's very important to be anti-capitalist, and then you got to think about the broad front. If you're anti-capitalist and we're in a capitalist world, the anarchists have one angle, the socialists have another angle, the left liberal Keynesian reformists have another angle, which I'm quite interested in because of the practicalities of
Hmm.
power. And since the front is broad, it's important to recognize that you got allies that you, in some fundamental ways, don't agree with, but they're still your allies because they too are anti-capitalist. So it's not quite as cynical as the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but it's more the front is broad, and people take different theoretical attitudes towards doing what effectively is good work, coming at it from different angles. And that's what I'd like to emphasize, and that's what I'm trying to cobble together as stories, because then the stories become quite interesting. Different characters can hold different views and argue with each other. You see that in the Mars trilogy to a gigantic extent. And I would never change a word of the Mars trilogy. I want to tack that in at the end there. It's long, it's cumbersome, it's naturalism set on Mars, maybe. But there was something magical had come down on me between me and that situation, that story possibility, and the structure that I chose, and the characters that emerged and spoke to me. Um, it's exactly the right length. I never had that feeling about what became Green Earth. That one, as I say, I crawled out of it, whereas I flew out of the Mars trilogy. And these are just emotional states, but I think you can see the traces in the texts as well.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I don't think I have anything. I don't think I have anything to add. I mean, I just want to agree. There's a bad version of anarchism, sometimes called lifestyle anarchism, that suggests that you can make your personal changes without taking part in this broader anti-capitalist front. That's bad. I'm with you. And also, yeah, the left Keynesians. I would say that's the thing that surprises people the most about my views. Since I call myself an anarchist, that I like the left Keynesianism. And it's like, well, I mean,
Hmm.
they've got a playbook that will make the world better, and that's better than a playbook that will make the world worse. So that's good enough for me.
Yes, yes. I do want to say that a lot of this that was saving my brain in writing Green Earth was, in fact, Emerson. And when I was, and it was in those years where I suddenly realized that it was really the real thinker there was Thoreau,
Hmm.
and at least in terms of my own affinities. And I think it's now generally regarded that as interesting and foundational as Emerson was, and you can concoct a single volume of Emerson's that is incredibly impressive. I mean, beautiful. But he's a scattered mind, Emerson. He writes a sentence, and then in the next sentence he contradicts himself, and he can't hold a thought through even a paragraph, much less a whole essay. So he's like a fortune cookie writer, aphorisms, sentences, provocative and beautiful, like a poet, but not a coherent thinker. Whereas Thoreau, you talk about your naturalism. I
Yeah.
mean, let's write down every day in obsessive detail. And his journal is literally a naturalism because he was a naturalist. And talk about bric-a-brac. Let's find out what the snails are doing today. Let's find out how deep the Concord River is, all the way up and down its length. You know, these his projects. He was project based and obsessive, and perhaps autistic, and he was everything um, that is interesting. And Thoreau is was the great discovery. So when I was writing Green Earth, I'm thinking, well, what's Frank gonna? How's Frank gonna think his way out of his box? And he had this Buddhist Satori, and he's talking to a reincarnated Buddhist Lama as his roommate, which cracked me up. But that stuff is so esoteric and spacey and foreign to Frank. I wanted to bring it back into the American grain, so to speak. And when Frank begins to start every morning with a paragraph of Emerson or Thoreau and begins to realize he's in a New England winter, this kind of Himalayan or Arctic winter that descends upon Washington, D.C., and he's learning from those guys and thinking, how do you be an American now? This again is a kind of drawing together of all kinds of different strands of thought. And some reader in the years about 2008 to about 2015, there was a website called Emerson for the Day, and it just had a one paragraph of Emerson or Thoreau. It had been inspired by Green Earth, as it said in the. This was before the title Green Earth, but it was inspired by my trilogy. And so I would check in on this internet, and whoever did it, I never met them, I never got a name, and they didn't do anything but a paragraph of Emerson or Thoreau per day, and then it kind of fell apart, and I don't think it's a live site on the web anymore. But for me, this was important too, to try to pull Frank's head together to the point where he could begin to do the shenanigans, and then all the stuff at the end of 60 Days and Counting, the political program, the stolen elections, all that stuff in the Trump era begins to look eerily, apropos. I mean, I was on to the right topics.
Yeah, I have no doubt, Stan, if I had read this novel 15 years ago, I would have thought the whole election theft stuff was going too far. The Bush era didn't feel. I mean, Bush v. Gore was such a boring, centralized, out in the open kind of electoral stealing conspiracy. That's the kind of electoral conspiracy we actually had
Yeah,
in 2000. In 2000, actually.
yeah.
With respect to the other thing, in terms of do we need to end now?
No, no, no. I just wanted to get that in, and
Yeah.
I see now, and really, we're just a tad over an hour, so it's about perfect. I just
It's perfect.
had to give the nod to. I have a plan now. I want to be an editor of Thoreau's journals. I want to, and this has been done before, perhaps even 20 times, to take Thoreau's journals and to make an extract from it that is maybe 5% of the length or even less, and present it as some kind of my best of Thoreau.
Yeah.
I've got the journal marked. I'm ready to go on it. It may happen someday.
Yeah, that's exciting. Yeah, the NYRB, I think Damien Searles did one recently that's good. That's a
Yes.
good excerpt. But yes,
Yes.
you've got yours.
Yep.
Kim Stanley Robinson, thank you so much for coming again on the Everyday Anarchism podcast. It's always so much fun.
Well, thank you, Graham. It's been a pleasure. And as I say, thanks for talking about Green Earth. Always fun. And yeah, let's do it again sometime.
Yeah.